As my heir, music, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Rothesay and takes on the full weight of the responsibilities that come with them. King Charles had faced family rebellion, public scandal, and private betrayal before, but nothing prepared him for the sealed investigation folder placed directly in front of him. Inside were succession planning files, secretly assembled under Queen Camilla's authority, documents outlining future royal roles, emergency power transfers, and proposed changes involving Prince William. Charles read the first page, stopped breathing for a moment, and remained completely frozen, music, as the room waited for him to speak. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The silence hardened around the table. Charles had expected an administrative mistake. Instead, he found pages bearing Camilla's handwritten instructions beside William's name. A succession plan, meaning the formal process for transferring royal authority from one sovereign to the next, should have been controlled by the king and his heir. Yet these files had been built beyond them, music, in absolute secrecy for months without consent. A senior courtier watched Charles remove his glasses and place them beside the folder. The king did not raise his voice. He simply stared at the same paragraph as disbelief gave way to fear. The confidential investigation had begun weeks earlier after unusual requests for succession records, music, constitutional briefings, and restricted family schedules were traced to her household. Now the inquiry had reached its brutal conclusion inside Buckingham Palace. Charles turned another page. One proposal called for a temporary advisory council during any period of royal incapacity. Royal incapacity meant a situation in which the sovereign could no longer carry out official duties. Camilla was placed at the center of communication, giving her influence over what William would be told, when he would be told, and who would stand beside him when power shifted. The next page cut deeper. William's access to sensitive briefings would be restricted until unnamed continuity conditions had been approved. The future king, the lawful heir, had been treated not as the person preparing to lead, but as a risk to be managed. Charles pressed one finger against the margin where the queen consort had written an instruction, hold until review. Then the king reached the entry that changed the room completely. It was not about William. It concerned Prince George and a private ceremony designed to give the child a symbolic role before any transfer of power. No authority had approved it. No parent had been consulted. Charles closed the folder halfway, but he did not release it. He had discovered the plan. Now he had to decide whether it was born from fear, ambition, or betrayal, and confront the family whose futures had already been written inside those pages. The documents were not merely about titles or ceremonies. They reached directly into the lives of a father, a son, a wife, and a future heir. Charles saw a marriage suddenly darkened by suspicion. William discovered that his own path had been discussed without him. Catherine recognized the threat to her children, and Camilla, now isolated behind a closed door, understood that every person named in those files would soon demand an answer. Charles had always viewed the monarchy as a fragile inheritance, something that could survive only if it passed to William with stability, dignity, and public confidence. Music, the crown, meaning the authority and responsibility carried by the sovereign, was not simply a symbol. It was a promise between generations. Music, for the king, that promise had now been disturbed by the one person who should have understood its weight. William entered the private room without speaking. He had spent years preparing for the throne, accepting that every choice, every mistake, and every public expression would one day be judged differently. Yet, the files did not present him as a prepared heir. They described him as emotionally unpredictable during a future transition and recommended that selected advisors control his earliest decisions. The prince read the paragraph twice. Then he tightened his hand around the back of a chair and asked with dangerous calm who had approved it. Charles did not answer immediately. That silence wounded William more deeply than anger would have because it confirmed that the betrayal had reached into his father's marriage and into the machinery surrounding his own future. Catherine received the summary later from her husband in a quiet family room. Music. She listened without interruption as he explained the proposed restrictions, the advisory structure, and the private notes about their eldest son. The princess remained composed until George's name was mentioned. Then her expression hardened, and she asked that George, Charlotte, and Louis be kept away from every palace discussion connected to the investigation. Camilla had written separately about Catherine as well. The notes warned that the future queen could quickly become the dominant public figure in the next reign, shaping sympathy, loyalty, and influence around William. The queen consort had treated Catherine's strength not as protection for the monarchy, but as a force that might leave others powerless. Charles felt the deepest wound of all. Camilla had prepared for his incapacity without trusting him enough to speak openly. She had planned for a future in which he could no longer defend himself, his son, music, or the line of succession. Then William noticed the same initials appearing across several pages. One advisor had reviewed nearly every major proposal. Camilla had not acted alone, and the planning had started far earlier than anyone realized. The family now understood what was at stake. But the true beginning of the crisis was buried in a ceremony months earlier when one private exchange pushed Camilla beyond the point of restraint. Music. Every royal rupture has a moment that appears ordinary until history looks back and recognizes the warning. In this story, that moment came during a closed succession rehearsal at Windsor. The ceremony was meant to test protocol, timing, and security. Instead, music. One brief exchange between Charles and William left Camilla standing outside the decision-making circle. What happened in that room became the specific trigger for everything later discovered in her secret files. Months before the investigation, Charles had approved a private succession continuity rehearsal involving William, senior advisors, and constitutional staff. A succession continuity rehearsal was a confidential practice session designed to test how royal authority would pass during an emergency. It mattered because one mistake could create confusion around the throne, music, frighten the public, and weaken the future king before his reign had even begun. Camilla expected to attend the final briefing. The discussion concerned the immediate royal household, emergency communications, and the public response to a sudden transfer of responsibility. Music. She believed her position beside Charles entitled her to understand what would happen if he could no longer lead. But the king had reached a different conclusion. Charles turned to an aide before the final session and said the room would remain limited to himself and William. Then he asked for the doors to be closed. The prince heard the instruction but said nothing. He understood why his father wanted direct control. Yet he also knew Camilla would see the decision as something far more personal. Camilla arrived moments later and stopped outside the sealed room. She could hear voices continuing beyond the doors. No aide invited her inside. No explanation came. The queen consort stood there in silence, then walked away before anyone could witness the anger building beneath her restraint. That evening, Camilla confronted Charles without staff present. She asked why she had been excluded from a discussion about the monarchy's survival. The king answered that the crown had to pass directly from sovereign to heir without emotional interference. Music. His words were controlled, but the wound they created was immediate. Camilla removed a bracelet and set it sharply onto the dressing table. She told him he had made her responsible for supporting the monarchy while denying her any voice in what would happen after him. Charles insisted the decision was constitutional, not personal. She did not believe him. Within 48 hours, requests began appearing for emergency access protocols, regency precedents, private schedules, and briefing structures connected to William. A regency was the legal arrangement used when a sovereign could not perform royal duties. One trusted member of Camilla's household created the first file under the harmless label continuity planning. Then everything darkened. Camilla obtained a confidential assessment of Charles's health and realized the transition she feared might arrive sooner than expected. What began as an act of exclusion had become a hidden system of control. And now Charles was ready to confront the woman who had built it behind his back. There were no advisors beside them, no cameras beyond the walls, and no ceremonial language left to hide behind. Charles entered the private drawing room carrying the investigation folder. Camilla was already waiting. He placed the files on the table between them and asked one question. Were you preparing for my death, or were you preparing to control what came after me? Her answer would shatter the last protection surrounding their marriage. Charles ordered every aide to leave because he wanted the truth without prepared language, legal protection, or palace interference. The investigation folder contained the official findings gathered from private records, staff accounts, and internal correspondence. Camilla recognized it immediately. The queen consort understood from its thickness that the inquiry had reached far beyond the harmless explanation her office had expected to give. The king opened to the page describing restrictions on William's access to future briefings. He demanded to know why his son had been treated as a danger instead of the lawful heir. Camilla answered that William's anger, distrust, and open hostility toward her could destabilize the monarchy during a vulnerable transition. She insisted that someone had to prepare for the chaos Charles refused to discuss. Charles pushed the folder across the table. Camilla did not touch it. She gripped the arm of her chair and told him she had acted because he would not prepare anyone for the possibility of losing him. The queen said his silence had forced others to plan around fear, uncertainty, and a future no one was allowed to name. Then Camilla admitted the files had been created under her authority. She said so directly during the private recorded conversation requested by the king for the investigation. But she also claimed the strongest recommendations had come from advisors who believed William would remove them the moment he inherited the throne. According to her, they feared not only losing influence, but being blamed for every failure of the previous reign. Charles turned to the section involving George. The pages proposed giving the boy a symbolic role during the transition, creating public pressure around family unity before William could challenge the arrangement. A symbolic royal role meant a public duty carrying emotional weight without formal constitutional power. Camilla had approved the discussion. The king's restraint finally broke. He told her that planning for continuity was one thing, but using his grandson as leverage was something no fear could defend. George was a child, not a shield. William was his heir, not an obstacle. Camilla lowered her voice. Then she revealed the final danger. One complete copy of the plan had already been sent beyond her household to someone capable of activating parts of it. The confrontation had exposed Camilla's fear, but the monarchy now faced a darker question. Who held that outside copy? And how much authority had already been placed behind it? Camilla's files did not exist in isolation. They were connected to advisors, private secretaries, legal consultants, and household officials who believed the next reign could erase their influence overnight. Behind the emotional betrayal was a colder struggle over access. Charles might wear the crown, but information shaped power inside the palace. And as the investigation widened, William realized that several people had been quietly preparing to control his first days as king. William sat alone with a list of names and marked each one carefully. 2 belonged to people he had trusted during major family crises. Both had attended private meetings linked to Camilla's plan. The prince did not fear continuity planning itself, meaning the preparation used to keep the monarchy functioning during a sudden transfer of power. He feared the attempt to present him as unstable, emotional, and in need of supervision. Charles faced an even darker truth. The succession files depended on access to medical schedules, constitutional advice, security planning, and confidential announcement procedures. Only a small group of senior officials could have gathered that material without triggering an immediate alarm. The king now understood that people serving his household had treated his health not as a private burden, but as an opening for future advantage. The pressure exploded during an emergency council meeting. Charles placed one marked page in front of the senior private secretary and asked why George's ceremonial schedule had been circulated without parental approval. The official hesitated. The king did not. He demanded a direct answer. The secretary admitted through a documented statement entered into the investigation that the schedule had been shared during a planning discussion led by Camilla's advisors. George's symbolic role had been described as a way to reassure the public, but William saw the truth immediately. His son had been turned into a tool designed to soften resistance and make the plan appear emotionally untouchable. Music. Investigators then traced the outside copy to a constitutional consultant. A constitutional consultant was a specialist who advised on how royal authority could operate within established law and tradition. That consultant had been asked to examine whether Camilla could retain a formal advisory position during the opening stage of William's reign. The discovery went further. Draft language had already been prepared to present the Queen Consort's continued involvement as an act of national stability rather than personal influence. Her control would not have been announced as power. It would have been disguised as duty. Charles ordered the entire network dismantled. Access was frozen. Meetings were suspended. Names were removed from future planning. But the order came too late. Before the final instructions could be completed, details of the investigation escaped the palace and reached the press. The struggle had moved from private rooms into dangerous motion, and the first leak would force every member of the family to face consequences they could no longer contain. The first leak did not reveal the entire plan. It revealed just enough to cause panic. A broadcaster learned that secret succession documents had been seized from within Camilla's household, and suddenly every silence became suspicious. Music. Phones rang across the palace. Advisors destroyed draft schedules. Staff members were removed from offices. But the most painful reaction came from Camilla herself when she realized that Charles had begun acting as king before speaking to her again as a husband. Palace communications officials received advanced warning that a national broadcaster planned to report the internal investigation. The report focused on unauthorized succession planning, meaning preparations made without the approval of the sovereign and lawful heir. That distinction mattered because even the appearance of a hidden power structure could weaken public trust and make the monarchy look divided at the exact moment it needed unity. Charles moved immediately. He restricted access to sensitive files, suspended 3 household officials, and transferred all transition planning to a new joint team approved by himself and William. The king knew delay would look like weakness. Yet, every order also pushed Camilla further away from him. Camilla received the decision through a formal written notice from the royal household. Her private office would no longer have access to constitutional advice or succession material. She read the order twice, folded it with careful hands, and remained seated after everyone else left. The Queen Consort felt publicly reduced before Charles had fully listened to the fear behind her actions. William watched the punishment unfold with mixed emotions. The prince wanted accountability because the files had targeted him, involved George, and questioned his ability to lead. But he also feared that humiliating Camilla would deepen his father's isolation. Charles had survived public pressure before, but losing trust inside his marriage was different. Catherine found her husband awake after midnight. She listened as William admitted he no longer knew whether protecting his father meant defending him from Camilla or stopping him from destroying their marriage. The princess reminded him that mercy without limits would invite the same danger again, while punishment without compassion could break Charles completely. Investigators then confirmed the harshest language against William had been written by Camilla's advisors. But she had reviewed the final file and approved it without removing the accusations. That choice made her responsible even if fear had started the process. Charles cancelled the proposed advisory council. He destroyed its draft authority and ordered George's name removed from every unauthorized document. The monarch had finally ended the machinery of the plan. Then he sent one private message to William. Charles wanted to meet without aides, legal staff, or prepared statements. Not as sovereign and heir, but as father and son. The plan was collapsing, but the family's future would now be decided in a room where no title could protect either man. After days of accusation and institutional panic, the turning point came without witnesses. Music. Charles and William met in a private room with no aides, no folders, and no prepared remarks. For once, the crown was absent from the conversation. There was only a father forced to admit that fear had entered his marriage, and a son forced to confront how deeply years of distrust had shaped the people around them. Charles chose a small room at Clarence House instead of a formal palace office. Clarence House was his private London residence, a place connected more closely to family life than royal command. The choice mattered because the king did not want ceremony between them. He wanted honesty, even if that honesty hurt. William arrived expecting instructions. Instead, he found 2 chairs and a handwritten note asking him to speak freely. The prince sat down, but neither man spoke at first. Years of duty had taught them how to address crises in public. It had not taught them how to admit fear to each other. Charles finally broke the silence. He confessed that he had avoided detailed succession discussions because speaking about incapacity made him feel as though his family was already preparing to live without him. The king said, every rehearsal, every emergency plan, and every question about the future had sounded like a quiet farewell. William listened without interruption. Then he admitted something equally painful. His guarded behavior toward Camilla had helped create the fear that she would be discarded the moment he became king. The future monarch did not excuse her secret files, but he accepted that years of cold distance had made her believe she needed protection from him. Charles reached across the table and placed his hand over the note. Music. He told his son that protecting Camilla could never require weakening William or involving George. The child was not a symbol to be used. Music. The heir was not a threat to be controlled. That boundary, he said, would never move again. Then the king offered William immediate access to every transition document and asked him to lead a new succession framework. A succession framework was the clear set of plans guiding how authority, duties, and public responsibility would pass to the next sovereign. This time, nothing would be hidden. William agreed on one condition. Camilla would receive dignity, personal security, and respect, but she would hold no independent authority over the transfer of the crown. Charles accepted without argument. Father and son reached a final understanding. Neither would allow private resentment to become constitutional policy again. Their unity changed everything. Camilla now faced one choice. Music, accept the limits they had established or lose her place within the family she had tried to protect herself from. Charles and William had repaired the line between sovereign and heir, but the emotional verdict still depended on the woman whose secret planning had brought the monarchy to the edge. By morning, the private crisis had become a national spectacle. Newspapers carried Camilla's name beside the word succession. Broadcasters debated whether fear had become ambition. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, waiting for movement behind closed gates. Yet one single public image captured the mood more powerfully than any commentary. A newspaper held against the railings of Buckingham Palace with Charles's frozen expression above a headline about secret plans for the crown. The palace released a formal statement confirming that unauthorized succession planning materials had been discovered and that every related proposal had been cancelled. Constitutional stability meant the continued lawful operation of the monarchy without confusion over who held authority. The statement was designed to protect that stability, but it did not deny Camilla's involvement. That omission told the public the crisis had reached the centre of the royal marriage. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd formed around one front page carrying the words, "The Queen's Secret Crown Plan" beneath photographs of Charles, Camilla, and William. Some people stared in silence. Others argued over whether the files showed fear, ambition, or betrayal. The image spread quickly because it reduced the entire scandal to 3 faces and one brutal question. Who had been preparing to control the future? A live broadcaster described the story as a conflict between marital loyalty and lawful succession. The phrase traveled across television and radio throughout the day. Supporters said Camilla had acted from terror that she would be abandoned after Charles was gone. Critics answered that private fear could never justify an attempt to shape William's reign. Camilla watched the coverage alone. She turned off the television when a commentator called the plan a hidden power grab. Then the Queen consort quietly asked an aide whether Charles had seen the same headline. The aide said he had. She asked nothing more. Charles understood the public danger immediately. If the king appeared divided from William, the scandal would grow into a crisis of confidence. If he stood beside his son, the message would be unmistakable. The crown would move forward through lawful succession, not private pressure. William appeared with his father at a scheduled engagement that afternoon. The prince stayed close to the monarch, and neither man addressed the files directly. Music. Their unity did the speaking. It showed the country that sovereign and heir stood together after the secret plan had failed. Camilla did not attend. Her absence carried its own meaning. The family had already reached a private decision and she was no longer part of the public response. Music. That decision would not remove her title. It would do something more lasting. It would redefine her authority, her marriage, and her place in the future monarchy. The world had delivered its judgment in headlines. But the final and most painful verdict would be spoken behind palace doors by Charles himself. The crisis ended not with exile, abdication, or revenge, but with a boundary that could never again be crossed. Charles summoned Camilla for one final private conversation. The secret files had been destroyed, the advisors removed, and William's authority restored. What remained was the truth between husband and wife. Camilla had tried to protect her future through control. Charles now had to decide whether their marriage could survive without the power she had attempted to secure. Charles placed the final investigation summary on the table and waited for Camilla to sit. The document recorded the official findings, meaning the complete account of who authorized the planning, what powers were proposed, and which limits had been broken. Clear as throat. The king told her he would protect her dignity, but he would never allow her to manage the crown beyond his reign. Camilla did not argue. She admitted during their recorded private conversation that the Windsor exclusion had awakened her deepest fear. Once Charles was gone, she believed she would become unwanted, unprotected, and erased from the family she had spent years defending. Music. The Queen consort said that fear had pushed her to build security where trust should have been enough. The king listened. Music. But he did not soften the truth. He told her that fear explained her actions, yet it could not excuse them. Trust could return only if she accepted a future without constitutional influence. Constitutional influence meant the ability to shape how royal authority passed from one sovereign to the next. That power, he said, music, belonged to the lawful line of succession. Camilla surrendered all access to transition planning. She disbanded the private advisory circle and agreed that William and Catherine would control every preparation involving George, Charlotte, and Louis. The Queen remained beside Charles as his wife, but her role was permanently limited to supporting the reigning monarch, never directing the authority of the next one. William accepted the decision after receiving a written summary from his father. The prince did not call it forgiveness. Music. He called it a stable boundary that protected Charles, secured his own future, and kept George beyond the reach of private strategy. The investigation revealed the monarchy's deepest danger. It was not public attack. It was private fear hidden behind loyalty. Charles chose his son's lawful future over secrecy, while Camilla remained within the family, only after surrendering the control she had tried to preserve. The files were sealed. The network was dismantled. The succession returned to a clear path from Charles to William and eventually George. The crown survived because trust was rebuilt through truth, limits, and accountability. Not because betrayal was ignored. There was nowhere else for the conflict to go. Charles had protected his marriage without sacrificing the succession. William had secured the future without destroying his father. And Camilla had finally learned that a place beside the crown could never become ownership of what came after it. Music. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.